Königsberg, January 1945. The East Prussian capital is encircled by Soviet forces advancing from three directions. Civilian refugees flood westward through freezing temperatures, trying to escape before the city falls. German military units are fragmenting into isolated pockets of resistance. And in the basement of the Gestapo headquarters on Steindamm, SS officers are burning files as artillery shells fall closer each day, the impact tremors rattling the walls. Among those officers is Sturmbannführer Walter Kraus, assigned to the Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence service of the SS. Born 1909 in Hamburg. Law degree from Königsberg University, 1932. Recruited into SD in 1935. His specialty: economic intelligence, monitoring trade networks, tracking foreign currency flows, analyzing industrial production in occupied territories. Not ideological enforcement, not racial policy, not the machinery of persecution. Technical work that required financial expertise and linguistic skills in Russian and Polish. By January 1945, Kraus holds a position coordinating SD intelligence operations in East Prussia as Soviet forces close in on the city. His role is managing the evacuation of intelligence personnel and materials before the city falls, determining what can be saved and what must be destroyed to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. On January 21, 1945, with Soviet artillery audible in the city center and the final collapse only weeks away, Kraus is seen leaving Gestapo headquarters carrying 2 leather briefcases. Multiple witnesses later testified to his departure during post-war investigations. Some remember him in SS uniform, the lightning bolt insignia visible on his collar. Others recall civilian clothes and a Wehrmacht officer's greatcoat. All agree he walked toward the harbor district where evacuation ships were still departing westward. That was the last confirmed sighting by German witnesses in Königsberg. But Allied records tell fragments of a different story, pieces that don't quite fit together. On February 3, 1945, a Soviet NKVD report file from occupied Poland mentions the detention of German intelligence officer claiming willingness to provide information on Nazi economic intelligence operations in occupied territories. No name given, just a notation that the subject was being transferred to NKVD headquarters for interrogation and evaluation. On February 18th, a British intelligence officer in Stockholm sends a coded message to London referencing German SD officer, formerly Königsberg, currently in Soviet custody, reported willingness to cooperate regarding Nazi intelligence methods and personnel. On March 8, 1945, with the war entering its final weeks, an American OSS memo discusses reports of German intelligence personnel in Soviet hands being offered for intelligence exchange pending verification of information value. And then silence. When the war ended and Allied authorities began compiling lists of SS and SD personnel for war crimes prosecution, thousands of names were documented, locations tracked, fates recorded. Officers from the Sicherheitsdienst faced particular scrutiny for their roles in intelligence operations and occupation policies that had enabled the machinery of the Reich. But Sturmbannführer Walter Kraus appeared on no Allied arrest lists, no Soviet prosecution rosters, no war crimes tribunal records. For someone with his rank and organizational affiliation, the absence was extraordinary. It would remain unexplained for 80 years. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. The Sicherheitsdienst was the intelligence branch of the SS, responsible for foreign and domestic intelligence gathering, security operations, and ideological surveillance. But within SD, there were technical specialists whose work focused on economic intelligence, industrial capabilities, financial networks, the bureaucratic machinery that made modern warfare possible rather than the ideological enforcement that defined the organization's public face. Kraus's career file, pieced together from fragmentary SS archives captured by Soviet forces and later accessed by Western intelligence services during the Cold War, shows a pattern of assignments focused on economic analysis rather than security operations. Junior officer in the mid-1930s analyzing Soviet industrial production capacity. Assignment to Vienna in 1938 evaluating Austrian financial systems after the Anschluss. Posted to Warsaw in 1939 assessing Polish economic infrastructure and resource flows. Each assignment involved gathering intelligence on economic capabilities, industrial production, resource networks, technical work that required analytical skills rather than ideological commitment. By 1942, Krauss was senior staff in Berlin, producing assessments of Soviet economic capacity and Allied industrial production for SD leadership. A personnel evaluation from that year, preserved in captured documents, describe him as technically proficient in economic analysis, politically reliable, ideologically uncommitted, valuable for specialized expertise. In late 1944, as Soviet forces advanced toward Germany and the Eastern territories collapsed, Krauss was assigned to Königsberg to coordinate intelligence operations in East Prussia. It was a position of trust. He had access to operational files, personnel records, and economic intelligence assessments compiled over years of SD operations in occupied territories. The circumstances of his departure from Königsberg on January 21, 1945, remain unclear even in fragmentary records that survived the war. Königsberg was being evacuated, but evacuation was chaotic, disorganized, with military personnel competing with civilians for space on ships leaving the harbor. Some witnesses later testified that Krauss seemed to have specific plans, that he walked with purpose rather than the panic that gripped most of the city as Soviet forces closed in. When Soviet forces captured Königsberg in April 1945 after a brutal siege, they seized extensive SS and Gestapo records that had not been destroyed during the evacuation. Among those documents were references to Krauss in operational summaries and personnel rosters, showing his assignments and responsibilities. But his personnel file was missing from the captured archives, and there was no indication of what had happened to him after January 21st. In June 1945, Soviet authorities requested information from Western allies about former SD officers who had specialized in economic intelligence operations. They were interested in personnel who might have information about Nazi industrial networks, financial systems, and resource flows in occupied territories. Information that would be valuable for understanding how the German war economy had functioned and for identifying assets in former occupied areas. Krauss's name was on their list, flagged as having held senior positions in economic intelligence. The British response, delivered through military liaison channels, stated, Subject Walter Krauss, former SS Sturmbannführer, no information available, not in British custody. The American response was similar. No current information regarding Subject Krauss, not in U.S. detention or processing. The Soviets provided additional details in a follow-up inquiry, noting they had detained someone matching Krauss's description in February 1945 in occupied Poland, but that the individual had been transferred to higher authority within the Soviet intelligence apparatus, and they had subsequently lost track of his whereabouts. They requested clarification about whether he was now in Western custody. The Western responses remained unchanged. No information available. In 1947, the U.S. State Department compiled a comprehensive report on Nazi economic intelligence operations, drawing on captured documents and interrogations of German officials who had worked in economic ministries and intelligence services. The report examined how the SD had gathered economic intelligence, how they had assessed Allied industrial capacity, how they had monitored resource flows in occupied territories. Krauss's name appeared in the report's source notes and bibliography as someone whose position and expertise suggested he should have been interviewed for the study. But there was no interrogation record, no technical debrief, no indication he had provided information through official State Department channels. An analyst working on the report filed an internal inquiry about the absence, noting the gap in coverage given Krauss's senior position in SD economic intelligence. The response, preserved in State Department files declassified decades later, stated, Subject Krauss handled through alternative arrangement. Materials classified under separate program. No access authorized for the study. Alternative arrangement. Separate program. The phrases suggested something outside normal intelligence exploitation procedures. Some process that existed beyond the standard interrogation and documentation of captured German personnel. Through the 1950s and 1960s, historians researching SD economic intelligence operations occasionally encounter Krauss's name in captured documents held in various archives. He appeared in organizational charts showing SD's structure, in operational reports describing intelligence assessments, in evaluations of Soviet industrial capacity produced during the war. Always in technical contexts, always in positions suggesting specialized knowledge of economic intelligence methods. But there was never any information about what happened to him after January 1945. Reference works on SS personnel listed him as fate unknown, presumed died during Königsberg evacuation or in Soviet captivity. Most historians assumed he had perished in the chaos of the Eastern Front's collapse, another casualty of the catastrophic final months. The complete absence of any confirmation was unusual, but in the context of East Prussia's final months, it seemed plausible. Thousands had died during the evacuation, their bodies never recovered, their fates never confirmed. One more name in a long list of the missing seemed unremarkable. The silence was systematic, but not obviously managed. Files were incomplete, but many files from that period were incomplete. His name appeared in fragments, but never with enough detail to establish what had happened. It was the kind of silence that could be accidental, the result of wartime chaos and incomplete documentation, or it could be deliberate, carefully maintained across decades and archives, protecting not just a person but the circumstances of that person's survival. Dr. Andreas Muller was researching Allied intelligence operations during the immediate post-war period, focusing on how Western powers gathered economic intelligence about Soviet industrial capabilities as the wartime alliance dissolved into Cold War competition. A historian at the Free University of Berlin, Muller had spent years working through declassified American, British, and German archives, trying to understand how intelligence services had transitioned from wartime cooperation to Cold War confrontation. In 2023, while reviewing recently released CIA files from the late 1940s, part of a routine declassification cycle, he found a memo that caught his attention. It was an internal assessment from 1948 discussing high-value German economic intelligence specialists currently employed under protected status. The memo listed criteria for evaluating former German personnel: knowledge of Soviet economic systems, cooperation with Allied intelligence operations, absence of direct involvement in atrocities, potential value for understanding Soviet industrial capacity and economic organization. One entry read, Subject engineer Walter Krauss, former SD economic intelligence, extracted from Soviet custody March 1945 through intelligence exchange arrangement, provided extensive debriefing on Nazi economic intelligence methods and Soviet industrial assessments compiled during wartime operations, currently employed in analytical capacity regarding Soviet economic capabilities, classification, protected, identity protection, permanent, engineer, a code name, and a revelation: Krauss hadn't died in evacuation or disappeared into Soviet captivity. He had been extracted from Soviet custody through some kind of intelligence exchange arrangement and had been working for Western intelligence services. Mueller requested the full engineer file through Freedom of Information Act channels. The response came months later. Requested materials remain classified under National Security Exemption 50 U.S.C. 3024-I, Intelligence Sources and Methods, access denied. He tried different approaches, searching for cross-references in other declassified archives. In a 1949 State Department budget document, partially declassified in 2020, he found a line item for Economic Intelligence Consultants, Soviet Industrial Analysis with notation, Engineer Arrangement, Specialized Knowledge Soviet Production Capabilities, Annual Cost $12,000. In a 1952 CIA memo discussing cooperation between American and British intelligence services on Soviet economic assessment, there was a paragraph about former German specialists providing valuable analytical support on Soviet industrial systems and resource networks based on wartime intelligence operations. None named Krauss explicitly, but the codename engineer, the timeline, and the specialty aligned perfectly with his background and expertise. The breakthrough came from British archives. In 2024, MI6 released files from early 1945 discussing intelligence cooperation with Soviet services regarding German personnel of mutual interest. One memo, dated March 1945, discussed a specific case, Subject engineer Walter Krauss, SD Economic Intelligence, currently in Soviet custody following detention February 1945, occupied Poland. Soviet intelligence indicates willingness to transfer subject to Western custody in exchange for German personnel of interest to Soviet operations. Subject has extensive knowledge of Nazi economic intelligence operations and Soviet industrial assessments that will be valuable for post-war economic analysis. Recommend acceptance of exchange arrangement with permanent classification of circumstances given sensitivity of cooperation with Soviet services. March 1945. While the war was still being fought, before Germany surrendered, while the Allies were still nominally cooperating, intelligence services were already negotiating exchanges of German intelligence personnel based on their anticipated value in the emerging competition between former allies. A follow-up document from April 1945 confirmed the arrangement. Engineer exchange completed. Subject transferred from Soviet to British custody per agreement. Initial debriefing confirms high value of subject's knowledge regarding Soviet economic systems and industrial capabilities. Recommend employment arrangement with identity protection given sensitivity of exchange circumstances and potential Soviet objections to revelation of cooperation. Krauss hadn't escaped on his own. He had been detained by Soviet forces in February 1945, then transferred to British custody in March through negotiated exchange. The Soviets had traded him for German personnel they considered more valuable to their own intelligence operations and post-war objectives. But the most revealing document came from American archives released in 2025. A 1947 CIA assessment discussed former German intelligence personnel whose employment must remain classified due to circumstances of acquisition. One paragraph read, Engineer obtained to exchange with Soviet services March 1945. Employment justified by extensive knowledge of Soviet industrial capabilities and economic intelligence methods developed during wartime SD operations. However, revelation of exchange arrangement would complicate relations with Soviet government and potentially compromise similar future arrangements. Recommend permanent classification of subject's identity and employment circumstances. Public acknowledgement that Western and Soviet intelligence services were trading German personnel, while still wartime allies, would undermine post-war diplomatic posture. The reason for 80 years of silence became clear. Krauss's survival and employment weren't just protected to shield him from prosecution or to preserve his intelligence value. They were classified because revealing them would expose intelligence cooperation between the Soviets and Western powers at the very moment those powers were becoming enemies. Cooperation that involved trading German intelligence officers like commodities in a marketplace, dividing up expertise based on anticipated Cold War needs. But crucial questions remained unanswered, protected by classification barriers that showed no sign of coming down. What exactly had Krauss provided that made him valuable enough for the British to negotiate an exchange? What German personnel had the Soviets received in return? Where had Krauss lived during decades of employment? And what had his work contributed to Cold War intelligence operations? Mueller filed formal requests for full declassification of the engineer file and related exchange agreements. The responses stated that materials related to engineer operation remained classified, that information regarding intelligence exchanges with Soviet services during World War II remained sensitive for diplomatic reasons that could not be disclosed, that no additional release was authorized at this time. He found one final document in a 2025 release of CIA administrative files. A 1973 memo discussing pension arrangements for retired intelligence assets whose service remains classified. The memo noted, Engineer Walter Krauss, retired 1970 after 25 years service in analytical capacity, relocated redacted under protected identity per standard procedures. Monthly pension authorized per contractual agreement. Classification of identity and employment circumstances maintained per 1945 security determination. Subject cooperation regarding Soviet economic intelligence contributed significantly to Cold War economic analysis programs and understanding of Soviet industrial capabilities. 25 years. From 1945 to 1970. Krauss had worked for Western intelligence services for a quarter century, analyzing Soviet economic capabilities based on his wartime expertise, and continuing to provide value long after the war ended. And his identity, his location, his entire post-war existence remained classified, sealed behind bureaucratic barriers that outlived everyone who made the original decisions. The truth about Sturmbannführer Walter Krauss is no longer completely hidden. It exists in fragmentary declassified documents, in partial file releases, in careful cross-references across multiple archives. He was detained by Soviet forces in February 1945. He was transferred to British custody in March through a negotiated exchange between Allied intelligence services. He was employed by Western intelligence for 25 years analyzing Soviet economic capabilities. He lived somewhere under a protected identity until at least 1973, possibly longer, but the full story remained sealed behind classification barriers. The documents that would answer essential questions. What exactly did he provide during his employment? What German personnel did the Soviets receive in exchange for him? Where did he live after retirement? When did he die? What was his real contribution to Cold War intelligence operations? Those documents remain classified in Washington and London. In 2025, a retired CIA officer, speaking anonymously to a journalist researching Cold War intelligence history, said something revealing. The Krauss case represents the most awkward category of Cold War secrets. He was SS. He was traded like commodity between intelligence services that were supposed to be allies fighting together against Nazi Germany. And then he was employed for decades while we were telling the public we were prosecuting war criminals and building a new moral order. The exchange arrangement is what makes it impossible to declassify even now, because it reveals that in 1945, while still fighting together, the Soviets and Western allies were already dividing up German intelligence personnel based on who would be useful against each other. That's not a story anyone wants to tell. Even 80 years later, Mueller's research revealed something beyond Krauss's individual story. In the declassified documents, he found references to similar cases designated by similar code names: engineer, architect, designer, planner, each described as obtained through exchange arrangement 1945, employment classified, identity protected permanently. Each file remained classified. Each exchange remained unexplained. Each case suggested a systematic program of intelligence cooperation between the Soviets and Western powers, even as those powers were preparing for confrontation. In early 2026, Mueller received an anonymous email sent through an encrypted service. The message was brief. You found engineer. Ask what the Soviets received in exchange for him. Ask how many other German officers were traded between Allied services while they were still fighting together against Germany. Ask why that cooperation is still classified when the Cold War ended 30 years ago. The classification isn't protecting intelligence methods anymore. It's protecting the fact that the Cold War started before World War II ended, and everyone knew it. And they were already choosing sides while pretending to be allies. 80 years after Sturmbannführer Walter Krauss walked out of Gestapo headquarters in Königsberg carrying 2 briefcases and disappeared into a deal between intelligence services, his story is partially known. He was detained by Soviet forces in occupied Poland. He was exchanged to British custody through a negotiated agreement. He was employed for 25 years analyzing Soviet economic capabilities. He lived under a protected identity that remains hidden, died at an unknown date, and left behind no public record of his post-war existence. But the full truth remains locked behind classification barriers maintained by institutions that decided the circumstances of his survival were too complicated to explain. Not because they protected current intelligence methods, but because they revealed cooperation between allies who were already preparing to be enemies, who were already dividing up the spoils of victory based on anticipated future conflicts. The files exist. They sit in archives at Langley, in London, possibly in Moscow, marked with classifications that have never expired, protected by decisions made 80 years ago about what truths would undermine the narrative of the post-war order and the moral clarity of the Cold War. Because Krauss's story isn't just about one German officer who survived through a deal. It's about intelligence services dividing up defeated enemy personnel like assets on a balance sheet, about Allied cooperation that was already dissolving into competition while the war was still being fought, about deals made in secret that shaped the Cold War before it officially began. The streets of Königsberg no longer exist under that name. The city was destroyed during the Soviet assault, rebuilt as Kaliningrad, its German past systematically erased. No marker indicates what happened there in January 1945, who walked out of Gestapo headquarters carrying briefcases, who survived through arrangements made in the shadows between intelligence services already anticipating their next conflict. History records the collapse of East Prussia, the evacuation, the thousands who died in the freezing waters of the Baltic, but the ones who survived through arrangements between intelligence services, who were traded and employed and hidden for decades, those stories remain sealed behind classifications that may never be lifted. Walter Krauss survived the collapse. 80 years later, the archive revealed how, but not completely. Not who exactly was traded for him, not what they did afterward, not where he lived or when he died, or what name he used, just that he survived, and that his survival required secrets that have outlived everyone involved, secrets that reveal uncomfortable truths about how the post-war world was really built. Not on moral clarity and justice, but on deals made between spies who knew the next war was already beginning. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.